مساء الخير جميعا. Good evening. معالي وزير التربية دكتور محمد الفارس، شرفتنا بحضورك. سيداتي وسادتي الحضور الكرام، His Excellency Minister of Education, Dr. Mohammed al-Faris, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to present to you tonight Dean Susanne Wofford. Dean Susanne is the dean of a very special school at the University of New York called the Gallatin School of Individualized Study. And I will share with you some of her biography. Dean Susanne is the dean of Gallatin School. Before coming to Gallatin, Professor Wofford taught at Yale University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she served as the director of the Center for the Humanities and as the Mark Eccles Professor of English. Dean Susanne has been a visiting professor at both Harvard University and Princeton University. A distinguished scholar of epic poetry and Renaissance and early modern literature, Professor Wofford is the recipient of many prizes and honors. Her research interests include Shakespeare, Spenser, Renaissance, classical and epic poetry, comparative European drama, and narrative and literary theory. Her publications include a book by the title of The Choice of Achilles, the ideology of the figure in the epic. It was with this book that, as a young scholar, Dean Susanne really made her reputation in the academic and scholarly worlds. The Choice of Achilles was a book in which, through her research into Renaissance poetry and the classical traditions of literature, she was able to prove herself a formidable reader, not only of the poetry from the Renaissance era, but also of much older traditions of poetry and writing from a very different culture. This idea of combining traditions of learning and laying them over one another and using their various disciplines to illuminate aspects of learning in its different parameters is something that is central to the School of Gallatin that Susanne is the dean of. The Gallatin School of Individualized Study is the only school that maintains interdisciplinary approach as a central tenet of its learning within a university that follows disciplinary approaches to knowledge as a central parameter. I was introduced to the work of the Gallatin School last year when I had the honor of being a visiting fellow in their global faculty program. And for myself as a writer of theater and a director of theater, it was a great honor and privilege to work with academics and leading researchers who, in their own fields, were able to bring to my practice great depth and scope. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me, and I do thank our hosts, al-Athar, al-Islamiyyah, and in her absence tonight, I prefer the apologies of our host, Sheikh Hassa Sabah al-Salim, who was called away on urgent business to Jaipur in India. And with that, I'd ask you to welcome Dean Susanne Wofford.
Thank you so much, Suleiman, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all very much for coming on this evening. It's an honor to be able to speak briefly to you about some of my work and some of our collaborations. I want to thank especially Sheikh Hussa and Sheikha Hussa and Sheikh Nasser, both of whom have been very welcoming and supportive, and all the staff here at Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. It's really been a wonderful opportunity for me to learn and to be present here. I thought I would speak very briefly, although Suleiman has already done this for me, about my school, and then speak a little bit about the value about thinking about knowledge from angles that are not the most typical ones. In most universities, I think it's true here, it's certainly true in most parts of the West, in the United States, universities are organized around fields of study. Someone might be a scholar of economics, or English, or philosophy, or mathematics, or astrophysics, or business, commercial studies. But they rarely do those things in relation to each other. They rarely combine business, philosophy, astrophysics, and drama, for instance. What we found in our school was that this was a limitation that was very serious for students, that students were put in a position, first of all, they're young, they're 18 years old when they come to our school, and they're put in a position of saying, this is what I want to do for my life, this is who I am, this is what I want to be. But they're also taught a language and a way of thinking that's very much defined. I noticed Suleiman used this same hand gesture, a language and a way of thinking that comes very much from one framework. And yet the world of work that they'll go out into is a world where they need many frameworks. If you think even for someone like a journalist, how can you be a good journalist if you don't have many frameworks to put your understanding in? So first and foremost, we felt it was important for students to have a breadth that many universities don't succeed in finding a way to offer. And many universities think of knowledge in the framework of what we might call training. You need to be trained to do a certain thing. Like an acrobat might learn to do a certain acrobatic trick over and over again. But training isn't necessarily the same thing as knowledge. And the problem is, if all of our civilizations focus in this very disciplinary way, we may find that we're cutting off new avenues for knowledge. So what we do in our school, it's called the Gallatin School of Individualized Study and Interdisciplinary Study. And there are 2 or 3 things that make our school very special and enormously fun. And if any one of you comes to New York, I welcome you to come and visit our school, and we'll show you around. But first and most importantly, we don't divide our faculty into groups based on fields of study called disciplines. We don't have departments. We don't have a faculty of English. All of the faculty meet together and discuss what kind of learning should be developed. They discuss what courses, what curriculum we should have, what courses of study should be made available. But they do it in relation to each other. We have an ancient scholar who studies archaeology. We have working with a scientist who's interested in the theory of relativity. We put these people together and have them think about what should be taught. And that changes life. It actually changes life. Just as it's an enormous change of life for me to be in this wonderful setting, making so many Kuwaiti friends, whose point of view is not the same as mine. It's the same thing when you cross disciplines. So there's an international and there's an interdisciplinary value that we care about. Secondly, we do something that's very radical, which is we ask the students to design their own course of study. And the students sit with their faculty mentors, and they work very hard over 2 years to define a course of study that must be crossing these different boundaries and must have a focus and a topic that is the theme of what their studies are. And we think that at our very best, and we do have wonderful students, some of whom are the very best, we think that the students themselves, even young as they are, find new kinds of knowledge by bringing their courses of study together in the way they do. They might be studying a class in science and a class in history, and the teachers of those 2 classes might not know much about the other, but the student is required to link them together and to figure out what is the intersection of those 2 things. I should say, so that I'm not claiming in a way that might be incorrect, and I should say I'm delighted that there is an NYU alumna in the audience. But New York University is a wonderful university. It's a large research university. We have 40,000 students. So it's a very, very big university. My school is a small school inside of it. So part of what we do is we have our interdisciplinary, experimental, exploratory studies, and then the students also study in the other parts of the university. They take courses that are very traditional. In fact, our students take about 50% of their courses across the university learning about the disciplines. Because in a way, you can't be interdisciplinary if you don't know what the disciplines are in the first place. So we are very lucky. I don't think we would be as successful if we were a school that is just all by itself. So to go back to my school for just a minute more, though, we have this very special small community inside of a large research community. And we really believe that this kind of exchange, this kind of crossing of boundaries is something that transforms the experience of education for young people, but also for older people, for faculty who come to the school and have an opportunity to rethink their work. We have in our school architects, we have playwrights, we have theater practitioners, we have Latin American historians, we have people who work on the history of sound and the science of making sounds. We have all of these very different kinds of faculty, but when they come into the school, they have this enormous opportunity to think about working with across these kinds of boundaries in what one can only call a very powerful, creative collaboration. And this is something that I think is very special. It's not the right model for everything, but it's a very valuable one. And as I said, a small space within a big university is just the right thing to have this experimental opportunity. So that's just a little bit about my school, and I encourage you guys to go on the website and to, there's a film on the website that's called The Gallatin Philosophy, which you can listen to and meet some of the faculty I just referred to if you have any curiosity, or more importantly, if you have students who might want to come to NYU. So that's my life as the head of a school, a very special school that I'm very proud of. And in the context of that school, I had the great fortune to bring Suleiman as a visiting faculty member and watch him in the context of his theater practice. He was making a new play, working with scholars. One was a musician who's also a historian of jazz. Another one is a practicing artist who works on sound art, working with classicists and all sorts of other faculty who brought a different perspective, I think, to some of what he was thinking about for his play. So I was very happy then to be invited to come to Kuwait to learn more on this side. And I thought I would take just a few examples from my work to talk about interdisciplinary, pluridisciplinary approaches to knowledge, how it might change a little bit what things look like to you. So I am, among probably above all other things, a Shakespearean. I work on Shakespeare, I teach Shakespeare, I was the leader of the American Shakespeare Association. So I thought I would take two examples from my work and end by talking very briefly about a collaboration that brought me here to Kuwait. But first I should say, if I don't have enough time, I'll just stop, because academics are famous for talking too long, so I'm going to try to pay attention and not go on too long. So the first example that I thought I would take concerns the play of Twelfth Night, and this is a play that many of you may not know particularly well. It's a Shakespearean comedy, and it was, in fact, can I go back up on this? Does anyone know? Not sure, let's see. Yes, I'll put that off for a minute. Twelfth Night is a play that was set on the borders of what today we would call Croatia. And I'm just going to say a word or two about geography. But first, before I do that, I want to say something about Shakespeare's London. In the time of Shakespeare, this is all material that I did not know when I was studying Shakespeare as a graduate student. None of this was material that was present in the discourse or the scholarship or the discipline of English study when you studied Shakespeare. In the time of Shakespeare, England was a small island, a little bit on the edge of things. It wasn't the most advanced, it wasn't the most connected, but it did have a lot of trade. In that way, it was much like the port of Kuwait. And one of the things that Shakespeare would have seen on the docks of London were some of these things. Arab traders bringing goods from the Mediterranean. English sailors were beginning to develop trade routes into the Mediterranean. There were tensions, trade alliances, and there was trade and alliances in relation to the Ottomans. So the Ottomans were the richest, the most powerful, the most important empire in the Mediterranean. There was a problem that a lot of Christians who went off into the Ottoman territories would convert to Islam, but nobody noticed anyone from Islam converting back. So it was like, what is this about? Why are all of these people so drawn to this religion? It was a time of great corporate trading companies. The first corporations were invented, such as the East India Company. It was a time of enormous tension between xenophobia, fear of the foreign, and enormous cosmopolitanism, and a desire not to be left out, not to be insular, not to be secondary, not to be left out of that cosmopolitanism. But yet there was a lot of xenophobia in London as well. The power and impact of these interactions with the world beyond the borders of England transformed the literary and cultural productions of the period, including, obviously, the work of Shakespeare. Now, to turn to Twelfth Night, he sets Twelfth Night in a country called Illyria. And I put up here a description about Ortelius, the great map maker. So one of the things that people didn't look at when I was studying Shakespeare as a young woman was what were the maps? What was the history of cartography? What was the way that people visualized the world in that time? And if you look at the maps, you discover that Ortelius very clearly identified the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea and the surrounding countryside as Illyricum. And I'll show you an Ortelius map, but I have to apologize that my images are I'm not very good at putting images into PowerPoint, so they aren't great, but they give you a little bit of a picture of where Illyricum was, commonly called Illyria, or the Latin name. And I have a very blurry Latin map, which shows you the Latin principle. This is the 4th century of Illyricum, but I'm going to go back here because it's not quite as blurry. I was trying to blow it up. The Illyrians were a seafaring trading people centered around what is today Dubrovnik, and they were within the broader influence of Venice. So if you look it up on, say, Wikipedia, it'll tell you that Illyria was a Venetian, owned by the Venetians, controlled by the Venetians. But actually, it was a lot more complicated. When you study the history, you learn they also were tributaries of the Turk, the Ottoman Turk. Like the Istrians, who were even closer to the Venetians, they paid tribute to both sides. So they were very clever. They were sitting there in the middle of that Adriatic Sea. Let's keep those Venetians happy. Let's keep the Turk happy. They were a border place. The understanding of Illyria as marking a border space between the Ottoman Empire and the Western Christian world is today a major part of how I look at Twelfth Night, this play that was set there. It links it also with Othello, another play that was set on Othello is a tragedy set on Cyprus, and it's written in a time fictionally when the Ottomans haven't conquered Cyprus, but actually by the time Shakespeare wrote the play, they had. So he knew that it was an island that had gone back and forth between the Christians and the Turks. Now that we've lived through the tragedy of the 90s and the dismemberment of Yugoslavia and the realization and the founding of these multiple countries, we really understand the extent to which this place was a border between Catholic Christian Croatia, Russian Orthodox Serbia, and of course Muslim Bosnia, with much intermixing throughout these territories. The space is now understood to be marked by the history of these different empires and civilizations in a concrete and localized, and for the people who lived through the 90s, a tragic way. Bosnia being the farthest reach the Ottoman Turks came to in terms of geographic incorporation. So much of this is familiar to all of you, I'm quite sure. But when I was studying Shakespeare at university, as a member of the first class of women to attend Yale University, I encountered in a Shakespeare seminar a very, very different picture of Illyria. When one of the characters named Viola arrives in Illyria, she's in a shipwreck, she's lost her twin brother, She thinks he's died, and she thinks she's gone to heaven. He has gone to heaven, which she refers to as Elysium. So she says, "What should I do here in Illyria? My brother is in Elysium." The common sounds of those two names and the ways in which the Illyria was treated as a kind of fantasy place made people talk about it almost like the Wizard of Oz. A place like Oz that had dangerous pirates, oh no. But fundamentally a place far from anything that could be thought of as the real world, a place where desire and love could find fulfillment, where faith could be upheld. There's a wonderful line in the play where Viola realizes her brother has not died, and she thinks he's not been shipwrecked, and she says, "Prove true imagination. Prove true imagination." So she's imagining he could still be alive. But the play cares about that. It thinks that this is a place where the imagination could be true. So there's a lot of reason that Illyria was seen as a rather romantic and romance place. Nonetheless, the way that I was taught it was as a place where, I'll say a word or two more about the romance part before I change. Sorry. It's also a place, you know what? I'm not going to do this. I lost this page, and it's not that important. But Illyria was also a real geographical place. It was well known to early modern writers and travelers. It was not obscure or hidden or fantasy. It was simply there. It was a part of the geography. It'd be like saying, I set my play in, let's say, Catalonia. And someone would say, well, that's not a real place. That's a kind of fantasy place. No, that was not how it was. So once we look at history and look at cartography, we start to learn that it was a well-known place to early modern writers and travelers. It was a trading partner with most countries and city-states that participated in the very lively world of Mediterranean trade. And it was close to that crucial border between the Ottomans and the Christians, between the Muslim world and the Christian world, a border that was pushed to its westernmost, as I'm sure everyone here knows, in 1571 with the Battle of Lepanto off the Gulf of Corinth in western Greece, actually very near Illyria. So Illyria would have been a place very clear to Shakespeare, who mobilized the genre of romance to give a symbolic role to the setting of his play, but certainly was interested in its borderland qualities. The politics of Illyria, the play is all about a borderland space. And I'm really struck by some of the ways that Kuwait is similar as being so near these different great civilizations. Illyria was a small seafaring trading country. It wasn't huge in land mass and it wasn't powerful, but it was this in-between space. It understood both sides. It was a border place that is mobilized in a play in a way that just some sort of fantasy, utopian romance place never could have been. The crucial point, I think, for me as a Shakespeare scholar is how much is this crossing over, this borderland quality, linked in the play to the power of theater itself? How much is theater? I'm trying to understand theater. How does theater change when I think of it as a form that joins together these two very, very different worlds? So why was it that an understanding of the geography of the Mediterranean and the Eastern European world was so limited and brought to bear so rarely in the 1970s, at least in the United States? And truly, I don't know what would have been the case in many other countries. Why was this aspect of Shakespeare's play invisible to me as a college student reading Twelfth Night for the first time? My hypothesis is that the critical blindness to the rich geographical set of meanings mirrored a broader cultural blindness, perhaps even a willful blindness, a determination not to know and not to see, that was in fact created by the Cold War, at least from the point of view of a student in the US. And in Europe and the UK, it might have been different. I would venture that children growing up in what was then Tito's Yugoslavia would have been taught that Illyria was one of the older names for part of their country. But American scholars, at least, especially those who grew up after World War II, were coming into critical consciousness, I think. We were at a time when we were relatively vague about geographical boundaries and ethnic histories of the Balkans, precisely because these areas were closed off and blocked from our experience. My hypothesis then is that the lack of contact between countries and their peoples on either side of the so-called Iron Curtain made our Western scholarship start out ill-informed in relation to what Renaissance and early modern audiences would have known. So Shakespeare himself knew more and understood more than we understood. In other words, we may have projected onto Shakespeare, the great scholars, and I've not spent time giving you this, but there is an extraordinary tradition of really wonderful writing about this play that is all about this fantasy romance reading of Illyria. I hypothesize that we have projected onto Shakespeare and his contemporaries an ignorance that was in fact our own. And in this sense, I'm proposing a vision different from the kinds of knowing and not knowing that the experience of empire and colonialism created. My kind of not knowing, marked as it is by blindness to unseen and unacknowledged assumptions, is what has begun to change and what I think this kind of cross-disciplinary learning and cross-country, cross-borders, cross-cultural systems, when we bring those knowledges together, we come to a very, very different kind of understanding. So I use the phrase a kind of knowing and not knowing. So there's knowledge, and then there's things that you sort of don't want to know. And I was suggesting that American ideology, American values that saw these countries in the Eastern Europe and behind the Iron Curtain as sort of bad, repressed, terrible, we don't want to know about them, was essentially a willful blindness to things that were perfectly well known in Renaissance Europe. So that's one example. Do I have time for a second? Maybe I do. Actually, I haven't finished this example. I wanted to say that I'm going to indulge myself by speaking briefly about Suleyman al-Bassam's work, because a very different sense of the Illyrian location is developed in Suleyman's reimagining of Twelfth Night in a play called The Speaker's Progress, which a few of you may have seen, I'm not sure. This is to move into a very multi-layered in terms of history and time as well as place. So we're really looking at multidisciplinary, multinational, and also multi-historical. For the speaker in this play, he's a central character, Illyria is partly a past where theaters were open and performance was allowed. In the fiction of the play, that's no longer true. So Illyria is partly a past where theaters were still open and performance was allowed, a past outside the boundary of the modern totalitarian state that's imagined in the play. But as the play itself is set in the present tense, it's set in the location of its audience, and it's intended to be spoken mostly in the language of its audiences, wherever it's being performed. Whereas the envoys speak in Arabic to each other in the play, which otherwise is mainly in English. So this is a play in both Arabic and English. So already we have these two language traditions at work. Suleyman captures beautifully in this way a very different sense of the doubleness of the border space of Illyria and Twelfth Night. His play is set in a theater that marks the border and the intermingling of Arab and Western customs. It is set in two idioms. It is the space between no performance being allowed at all and performance that completely takes over. For al-Bassam, the reenacting of Twelfth Night that his play presents takes place in the context of an imaginary Arab kingdom, and yet it is also in the political present tense of a space that's neither inside nor outside that regime. So notice that it's both things. It's outside, but there's also a way you're inside. In a theater in another country where the audience appears to speak English, somewhere outside the state, but where the deep state, as Suleyman calls it, has its continuing presence in the form of a surveillance recording camera. So this sense of multiplicity and the different layers and the bringing together of history at different times is very much what he takes and builds into his version of Twelfth Night. So I had a question which maybe we can discuss towards the end. Does Suleiman think that the play opens up to this dual space in another country yet controlled by the deep space? Because of the geography of Illyria, because the original Twelfth Night was set on this border between the Muslim and the Christian world. I don't know if he was thinking about Illyria when he intuited the centrality of this doubleness, of this borderland to Twelfth Night. Perhaps in his creative moment, he didn't focus on Illyria per se, but his play artistically embodies, and it knows, it has a knowing at many levels, that Twelfth Night did this. And he uses Shakespeare's borderland geography to highlight this sense that theater can occupy the border between cultures, between two kinds of politics, between a globalized opening and local necessities. So this is one of my two examples, and I think I maybe have time just for a very most brief set of my second example. But I'll say just as a preface that at the end of the talk, I'd like to talk briefly about the island of Failica, where I had the pleasure to spend 2 days most recently. So I'm going to skip over my really blurry Blau map and move on to a very brief example from Macbeth. Do I have time to do Macbeth, do you think? I'll do 8 minutes, yeah? So many of you know the play Macbeth, I imagine. It's a tragedy of terrible, destructive ambition, and it's generally understood to be a moral play that teaches the dangers and horrors of letting ambition take you over. It's a play about regicide, a man who kills a king in order to be king. And it's summed up at the end of the play by Malcolm, who is the person who is now going to be king, the son of the previous king, as the story of a dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. So Macbeth, the hero of the play, becomes the butcher who has brought about all this blood. And this is all true. This is what, in fact, is the case about Macbeth. It is a great tragedy of ambition. But there's a set of other interesting things you learn about Macbeth when you learn something about the history. And I'd like to talk about Macbeth from the angle of something very specific that happens at the end, which is this. So at the very end of the play, Malcolm says, "My thanes and kinsmen, henceforth be earls, the first that ever Scotland in such honor named." Now, this might not seem that important. It's part of 2 or 3 sections. It's about 12 lines from the end of the play. But what he's saying is, the ending of this play is, the system that we used to have as our government is over, and now we have a new system. And the new system is marked by 2 important things. One is we're not going to have thanes, which was the Scottish word for their nobles, their leaders, and we're going to have primogeniture. The firstborn son of the king becomes the king. So in the old Scottish system, that was not true. In the old Scottish system, there was a system. Earlier in the play, his father has sorry about that. His father has announced this problem. He says, "We will establish our estate upon our eldest Malcolm, whom we name hereafter the Prince of Cumberland." So the important thing to understand about this is that Duncan was king, and he's saying, "I want my son to be king after me." But that was not actually the system that was used in Scotland at the time of Macbeth. If you read the historical chronicles, that is not, in fact, what was used. In fact, it was a system that was called tanistry, and it was a system by which people would look at all the clansmen of the king, and they would see who was best suited to take over when the king died. So rather than a kind of lineage where there's a patrilineal direction, right, there was a more horizontal idea. So a very typical choice would be a cousin or a nephew. It wouldn't necessarily be the king's son. especially not, as happened in, say, Shakespeare's play Henry VI, if the child was a baby. The Scots would never have that child be crowned king. I have a quote here, I'll try to read it very slowly, that gives you a brief sense. The ordinances decreed a law. This is from the Historical Chronicles. I don't think I have this up here. I think this is it. Yeah. Macbeth was very disturbed in the Chronicles by this announcement of the creation of a new system, which, by the way, was the English system. So it had to do with becoming more English and less Scottish, adopting this English idea of kingship as opposed to the Scottish idea of the clan, right? So the old laws of the realm said that if he should succeed, were not of able age to take charge upon himself, he that was next of blood unto him should be considered. And I have a longer quote that explains this. The ordinance also decreed as a law from thenceforth that if the king died, leaving no issue, leaving no child, no son, but such as were of age to succeed him, as such as were under age to succeed him, then should one of his nearest cousins, such as was thought most most appropriate to occupy the throne, be chosen to reign as king during his life. So not just until the little boy grows up, but for the rest of his life. And after this, his decease, the crown could revert unto his predecessors predecessors' issue without controversy, if the same were grown to the right age and could be successful monarchs. So Duncan's rejection of this system in favor of another English system of primogeniture is as much a part of Macbeth's motivation as the witch's prophecy, which for those who know the play, you'll remember the witches prophesy that he's going to become king. I'll just skip very quickly to say that under the system of tanistry, of this system of inheritance in Scotland at the time, almost nothing that the witches said in their prophecies to Macbeth are unusual. So one of the things that they say is that Banquo would not be king, but would beget them, would have children that would be kings. That was actually quite typical in the time. The same thing, it wouldn't be particularly troubling for Macbeth to be told that he would reign as king, but his children wouldn't be kings. That's actually pretty common, actually, in the system of tanistry. So it's an interesting moment that one of the ways to read the play is that Macbeth was attempting to reestablish the Scottish system against the English system. And I have here a quote that I thought might be interesting. If you look at the Chronicles, for 17 years, Macbeth rules as a really successful king. So listen to this. Macbeth, after the departure of Duncan's sons, used great liberal, this is after Duncan has been killed, in what in the Chronicles is represented as a group act, though Macbeth is the one who does the actual deed. He used great liberality towards the nobles of the realm, thereby to win their favor. And when he saw that no man went about to trouble him, he set his whole intention to maintain justice and to punish all the enormities and abuses which had chanced through the feeble and slothful administration of Duncan. So notice that Duncan, the previous king, is said to be feeble, not altogether there, and slothful, lazy. He didn't work hard. But this is important because in the Scottish system, if the king were not a good king, it was acceptable to overthrow him. So he had chance through the feeble and slothful administration of Duncan that many years after, all theft and rifings, I think that means takings away from people, were little heard of, people enjoying such blissful benefit of good peace and tranquility. Macbeth was accounted the sure defense and buckler. Buckler is the old English word for a shield. So Macbeth was felt to be a shield of innocent people. And here too he also applied his whole endeavor to cause young men to exercise themselves in virtuous manners. So young men were taught virtue under Macbeth. He made many wholesome laws and statutes for the public weal of his subjects. And I love the fact that among those things involved laws that allowed women to inherit if their husband died. So there was even a kind of interest in some sorts of justice for the female. So yeah, here it is. Holinshed records that many wholesome laws and statutes for the public weal of his subjects, such as giving the daughter the right to inherit, failing a male heir. When you don't have a male heir, the daughter was allowed to inherit. The lord's widow was allowed to inherit a third part of her husband's lands. So in England at the time, women couldn't really be owners and possessors, but in the Scottish medieval times of Macbeth, he brings about a law to support this kind of inheritance. So I won't go on longer about Macbeth. I've probably gone on a little too long. But I just wanted to give a sense of how different the play looks if you see it as through Scottish eyes and not only through English eyes. I think it's a story, I think of it in a context of being what we call an origin story, which is the story of how something came to be. And at the end of this lecture, I want to ask you if you know Kuwaiti examples of origin stories. Famous examples in the Western tradition include Kipling, who wrote the Just So stories, how the elephant got his trunk. Does anyone in this room register that? No. Okay. Ovid's Metamorphoses are all stories of origins, how the robin came to be, etc. And I think this kind of story of Macbeth is how we came to be more English, how we came to have primogeniture and a particular kind of English rule. But what's interesting is it holds within itself this other story. And when you study it from a historical point of view, you see the play as more of a tissue or a texture of these multiple ways of understanding history. And you see that the play, in fact, questions Malcolm at the end. Is he really the one that we as the audience and we, the Scots, are in favor of as he institutes himself as this king by descent? And Kurosawa, in his wonderful film of Macbeth, which is called Throne of Blood, ends the movie with Banquo, again, the cousin of the king, riding off and seeing the witches and hearing the prophecies again. And so there's a sense of cycle. So is the play the story of the butcher and his fiend-like queen, or is it also the story of a tension between two systems of rule, two countries, two measures of what a good king is? I'm not suggesting that the story of ambition and the terrible violence and destruction of the self that's brought about by the ambition and murder of the king is not there, but I think it's a play that really is interested in, again, that borderland between these two ways of understanding. So with that, I'd like to end by just saying very briefly that when I came to Kuwait, I had the great pleasure to be taken by Suleiman as his guest to Failaka, which is another fantastic border space between the ancient world of Mesopotamia, between the Greek world represented by the Temple of Artemis, between the Islamic world. There are Christian remains, which I didn't have a chance to go to that part of the island. And then, of course, it's contemporary historical tragedy, the representation of the horrors of the invasion of Kuwait and what it did to the island. You're seeing just a tissued, layered tissue of understandings in that space. And it was a very powerful experience for me, thinking, as I do so often, about how different kinds of knowledge from very different spheres and time periods can change the way you understand things. So it was a real pleasure to be there, and I'm here to be part of what we hope is the beginning of an extended collaboration with artists and scholars working across those boundaries, hopefully in connection with a residency that Suleiman has established on, for artists and scholars on Failaka. So with that, I'll stop, and I hope there'll be a chance for questions. And I hope this has been a provocative introduction to at least some questions about pluridisciplinarity and knowledge. Thank you.